Victorian mansions, those grand symbols of elegance and refinement, were in reality some of the coldest, darkest, and most uncomfortable homes ever built. They looked magnificent from the outside, but inside, people were voluntarily freezing, squinting through dim rooms and navigating a maze designed less for living and more for showing off. These houses weren't built for comfort. They were built to perform wealth, even if that meant the residents nearly needed a map, a coat, and perhaps an apology from the architect. So before we step through the heavy oak door together, take a moment. Feel the air change, colder than you expect, and catch that faint trace of gas lingering in the hallway. Hear your footsteps echo on stone as the outside world fades away. And look, people once spent their entire lives maintaining places like this. All I'm asking for is one free click. Subscribe. You know you should have done it already. Now tell me, what time is it where you are? Let's settle in, breathe a little deeper, and drift into the Victorian era. Imagine for a moment that a Victorian mansion isn't really a house at all. Not in the way you think of a house. A place where people live, relax, leave socks on the floor, or open the fridge just to stare into it. No. A Victorian mansion was something entirely different. It was a social statement first, a performance space second, a logistical nightmare third, and only after all of that, a home, technically. The architecture of these houses tells you everything you need to know about the society that built them. They were designed as physical blueprints of hierarchy, stone and plaster diagrams of who mattered, who didn't, and who was meant never to be seen if the system worked correctly. Because to understand the Victorian mansion, you must first understand this. It was built for two populations living two completely different lives inside one enormous structure. There was the world on display, the front stage, where the family lived, entertained, and performed their roles as refined, respectable Victorians. And then there was the world that powered the illusion, the army of servants who moved through the house with quiet precision, ideally without ever being noticed. These two worlds were so separate that they might as well have been on different planets. And in a way, architecturally speaking, they were. Let's start with the family's world, the part visitors were meant to admire. These were the grand corridors where ceilings soared dramatically overhead, as if competing with cathedrals. Every door was tall enough to make you feel slightly shorter than usual, and every room was arranged with symmetrical perfection, polished furniture, pristine draperies, and carpets thick enough to make your footsteps politely disappear. This was the realm of chandeliers, portraits, and careful quiet, though ironically a great many families rarely used half the rooms they displayed so proudly. If comfort was needed, they retreated into small morning rooms or private studies. The grand spaces were a bit like a formal Instagram feed, curated, spotless, and not representative of daily life. But the second world, the servants' world, operated according to a completely different set of rules, and it had its own architecture, carved into the shadows behind the polished veneer of the main house. The moment you crossed into this realm, everything changed. Ceilings lowered, corridors narrowed, staircases steepened, the decor vanished. Wallpaper? Absolutely not. Art? Don't be ridiculous. Comfort? Hardly. This was not a space meant to be seen. It was a space meant to function. One of the defining features of Victorian mansion design was the precise control of visibility. A proper servant was silent, swift, and ideally invisible. The house ran smoothly only when it looked as though it ran by itself. And so, architects created systems of back stairs, concealed doors, and narrow hallways that allowed servants to move from task to task without crossing the path of a visitor. In some homes, the family themselves could go weeks or even months without seeing more than a butler or a housekeeper. The rest of the household staff existed purely a suggestion. Fires were somehow lit. Rooms were magically cleaned. Meals appeared as if delivered by benevolent ghosts. Picture this. On one side of a wall, a formal corridor flooded with light from enormous windows. On the other side, a cramped passage barely wide enough for two people to pass. The divide was literal, and it was everywhere. A guest walking through the mansion's grand entrance hall would never know that, behind one of the carved panels, a small door led into a tight hallway used by staff to access bedrooms, kitchens, sculleries, and storerooms. The back stairs often twisted abruptly and rose at sharp angles, not because Victorians enjoyed steep climbs, but because servants were meant to take the shortest route between duties. Comfort was not part of the job description. In some mansions, even the floors communicated status. The family and their guests moved across plush carpets and polished wooden boards, while servants travelled across stone or bare planks, designed to withstand constant foot traffic. The differences were constant, physical reminders of one's place in the household. Interestingly, the separation extended vertically. The family occupied the middle and upper floors, the prestige levels, while servants lived at the top or bottom of the house. Basements housed the kitchen, scullery, storerooms, and sometimes the men servants' quarters. Meanwhile, the female servants slept in the attic, in rooms so small and cold they routinely woke to frost on the inside of their windows. The floors in between were sacred territory, reserved for social rooms, bedrooms, and the carefully arranged furniture that no one dared lean on too heavily, lest they disturb the perfect layout. The layout served a deeper purpose: silence, order, predictability. A Victorian household valued these qualities above almost everything else. Servants knew which doors they were forbidden to use, which hallways they should never cross, and which moments required them to simply melt away into the architecture. The house itself was designed to enforce this code. If a servant did everything correctly, they felt almost disembodied. If they made a mistake, they felt suddenly enormous, as if the whole structure turned its carved wooden eyes on them. Yet, for all this division, the two worlds were entirely dependent on each other. The grand spaces could not exist without the hidden ones. The elegant dinners required frantic activity in the servants' corridors. The illusion of calm required immense unseen labour. A Victorian mansion was in essence a beautiful swan, serene on the surface, all frantic paddling underneath. And the architecture reflected it perfectly. The moment you step inside a Victorian mansion, one thing becomes abundantly clear: elegance has absolutely nothing to do with comfort. In fact, the first few seconds inside the entrance hall feel less like entering a home, and more like wandering into some grand, ceremonious cavern that forgot to warm up before guests arrived. The door closes behind you with the softness of a guillotine, and suddenly the world outside, full of sun, air, and sensible temperatures, disappears. Ahead of you stretches a hallway so long and dim you might reasonably wonder if someone misplaced the concept of lighting sometime around 1873. The entrance hall of a Victorian mansion is a masterpiece of theatrical design. Not cosy, not warm, not remotely inviting. A statement. A statement that says, prepare to feel very small, and also, we have money, but apparently not enough to install a heating system. The ceilings shoot upwards so dramatically that you could stack a modern 2-story house inside and still have room for an ambitious chandelier. In many homes, those chandeliers stayed dark most of the time because candles were expensive and gas lamps were temperamental. So instead, visitors were welcomed with a soft, shadowy glow from wherever the nearest window happened to be. Spoiler, the nearest window was usually very far away. As you take your first steps inside, the cold air wraps around you like a polite but firm handshake. The temperature feels about 3 degrees lower than it should be, as if the house itself has given up on trying to retain warmth and decided to let you figure things out on your own. Tall ceilings are dramatic, yes, but they're also extremely good at trapping heat somewhere above head height, far, far above, where only the occasional spider might enjoy it. Everything around you absorbs warmth and refuses to give it back. Heavy stone floors, thick plaster walls, solid wood panelling carved so deeply it could double as a family tree. Even the air seems to have weight to it. Victorian building materials were chosen for their grandeur, not their ability to make you feel alive in the winter. And so the mansion swallows warmth the way a black hole swallows light. Speaking of light, there isn't much. Victorian architects adored long hallways. They loved them so much that they designed them with very little regard for natural illumination. You might see a window at one far end, a distant rectangle offering a hint of daylight, but the majority of the hall is left in a kind of elegant gloom. In some houses the hallway is so dim that even at midday you squint instinctively, not because it's bright, but because you're trying to convince your eyes to do something heroic. As you walk further in, your footsteps echo in a way that makes you vaguely aware of your own existence, your shoe choices, and your sudden vulnerability to the judgment of ancestors staring down from oil portraits. And yes, the portraits are always watching. That was the point. The Victorian entrance hall was not designed to make you feel welcome. It was designed to make you feel observed, not maliciously, just thoroughly, like every floorboard is holding its breath. The psychological weight of such a room is not accidental. Victorians prized first impressions above almost everything else. You did not simply enter a mansion. You arrived in it, the way a character enters the stage of a play. Every guest was meant to pause, straighten themselves, and reconsider every life choice that led them to be standing in that particular spot, beneath that particular chandelier, in that particular temperature. Even the furniture reinforces this mood. In many entrance halls you'll find a large imposing table covered with decorative objects nobody was allowed to touch. Perhaps a porcelain vase, perhaps an enormous floral arrangement, perhaps a sculpture of something symbolic and confusing. The table was always positioned just so, creating a sense of formality that whispered, "Don't lean on me. Don't set anything on me. Don't even breathe too confidently in my direction." Grand staircases often rise directly from these halls, curving upward in a way that says, "Look at me," but also, "Don't actually climb me unless you've been invited." These stairs are meant to impress. Broad steps, polished wood, carved balustrades. They reflect the wealth, taste, and aspirations of the family. But they do absolutely nothing to make you feel warm or comfortable. They are, in essence, a gilded reminder that this is not your house. And then there's the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Victorian mansions have a way of absorbing noise the same way they absorb heat. The thick carpets, heavy curtains, and upholstered furniture of later rooms haven't appeared yet, so your footsteps echo freely. But every other sound, gone. The hush is immense. Even your breath feels amplified, as if the house is waiting for you to say something profound and will be deeply disappointed when you do not. The overall effect is extraordinary. The entrance hall doesn't invite you to relax, it prepares you to behave. You become aware of posture, of tempo, of the fact that the Victorians took first impressions very seriously. The house does not welcome you like a friend, it appraises you like an interviewer. Yet this was the intended ambience. In the Victorian mind, admiration preceded comfort. Impress the guest first, warm them later, if at all. And so, as you stand beneath the towering ceiling, surrounded by shadow and stone, you experience exactly what countless visitors once felt. Awe, bewilderment, a slight chill at the back of the neck, and the quiet certainty that you have entered a world built according to rules that were never meant to be soft. One of the first surprises you encounter inside a Victorian mansion is that there seems to be a room for absolutely everything, except comfort. Comfort apparently was not a priority. But if you needed a specific room for a specific activity that you might only engage in once a month, yes, that they had. A whole room for it, in fact. Sometimes two. Walking through a Victorian mansion feels a bit like leafing through a catalogue of upper-class anxieties. Each room, a symbol, a performance. a polite announcement of status. There's a room to welcome you, a room to avoid you, a room to entertain you, a room to judge you, and a room to recover from your presence after you leave. And that's just the beginning. Let's start with the morning room, a pleasant-sounding space that rarely saw actual sunlight. Despite its name, it wasn't where people ate breakfast or enjoyed leisurely mornings. It was where the lady of the house handled correspondence, reviewed household accounts, and maintained the delicate balance of social obligations. Picture a small, brightish space furnished with elegant chairs that were specifically designed to look inviting, but somehow punished you for sitting in them too long. The air always carried a subtle seriousness, the kind that made you want to sit up straighter even if no one was watching. Then there was the withdrawing room, which sounds like a place where introverts might retreat for peace. Sadly, no. This was the room where women would withdraw after dinner, leaving the men to their cigars, their port, and whatever intense opinions they felt compelled to express without female ears present. The withdrawing room was a realm of delicate fabrics, polite conversation, and decorative items so fragile they seemed to shiver if you walked too quickly. It was the kind of a room that whispered, "Don't touch anything, don't spill anything, and please, for the love of etiquette, do not relax." If you continued your tour, you might come across a billiard room, a space dedicated entirely to the noble pursuit of hitting balls with sticks. This was a male-heavy environment filled with dark woods, heavy furniture, and the gentle fragrance of tobacco that clung to everything like a loyal shadow. The billiard room had an atmosphere of controlled mischief, respectable enough for polite company but just rebellious enough to make the morning room feel nervous. Nearby you'd likely find the smoking room, a place where men could retire to inhale burning leaves in peace. The walls were often covered in leather or dark paper to hide the yellowing effects of smoke. Everything in the smoking room felt slightly more relaxed, in a Victorian way, which means not very relaxed at all, but certainly less rigid than the formal parlours where posture was monitored like a competitive sport. Then there were libraries, which varied wildly in personality. Some were scholarly temples, lined floor to ceiling with books no one had read in decades, but which made the owner look extremely clever. Others were essentially dens with bookshelves, warm, comfortable and quietly smug, like they knew they were the best room in the house and didn't feel the need to apologise for it. Libraries were often the closest thing a Victorian mansion had to an emotionally supportive space. They were not exactly cosy, but at least they had chairs that didn't double as instruments of moral instruction. But as you move through these rooms, you start to notice a pattern. Everything has a purpose, a very specific purpose, a rigid purpose, and that purpose is almost never relaxation. Victorian homes were built on the idea that every activity needed its own stage, and every stage needed its own script. You didn't sit in the morning room to chat casually. You wrote letters. You didn't linger in the withdrawing room to unwind. You engaged in refined conversation. You didn't wander into the billiard room to lounge. You played billiards, or you pretended to. Every room dictated your behaviour simply by existing. And the emotional atmosphere shifted from room to room like a perfectly orchestrated play. Step into a drawing room, and the air tightens with formality. Enter the dining room, and you feel the weight of ritual settling on your shoulders. Walk through a study, and suddenly you are aware of every book title that might be silently judging your intelligence. Even the furniture reinforced this emotional geography. Victorian chairs, for example, are famous for two things: elaborate carving and a complete disregard for the human spine. To sit in one was to make a temporary pact with discomfort in exchange for elegance. Sofas were often so firm and upright they seemed built for people who felt guilty about relaxation. Tables were designed not for everyday use, but for symbolic placement. A vase here, a sculpture there, arranged with geometric precision. The result of all this is that Victorian mansions feel less like domestic spaces and more like exhibitions of lifestyle. The rooms exist not to make the residents comfortable, but to demonstrate that they could afford so many rooms. Comfort was a luxury. but apparently so was the decision to use it. And yet, there's something intriguing about wandering these spaces. As you move through them, you become acutely aware of your own presence, how you walk, how you sit, how you breathe. The rooms seem to ask something of you, even if you're only imagining it. They're beautiful, yes, but they're also demanding, structured, and quietly insistent that you behave according to their rules. Each room becomes a character, each doorway a transition, each chair a suggestion. And as you wander deeper into the mansion, you feel the architecture guiding, nudging and gently correcting your posture, as if it has been waiting decades to teach you how to exist properly within it. And honestly, if you've made it this far into a Victorian mansion without turning back, the least you can do is subscribe. It's free. It helps more than you think. If you've ever complained about being cold inside your modern home, please remember this chapter the next time you reach for the thermostat. Because Victorian mansions, those towering monuments to status and elegance, were essentially glorified refrigerators with better wallpaper. Winter inside one of these houses wasn't a season, it was a lifestyle, a daily negotiation between pride and frostbite. Let's begin in one of the grandest of contradictions, the fireplace. It was the beating heart of a Victorian winter, the centre of family life, the main source of heat, and also one of the least efficient inventions humanity has ever stubbornly continued using. A fireplace warmed exactly three things: the patch of air directly in front of it, the person lucky enough to stand in that patch, and the chimney. Everything else, the walls, the ceiling, the next room over, you, stayed cold. Victorian fireplaces lost up to 80% of their heat straight up the flue. It was like trying to warm your home by burning money while enthusiastically opening all the windows. But the Victorians were committed to the aesthetic. Nothing said refinement like shivering gracefully beside a flickering fire. Now imagine waking up in your elegant Victorian bedroom at dawn. Before you even open your eyes, you can tell winter is here. The air feels sharp, as if someone stored it in the freezer overnight for maximum authenticity. You sit up, exhale, and see your breath drift away from you like a ghost who decided to move out. Your windows, of course, are wearing their morning frosting, delicate crystals spreading across the glass as casually as if they paid rent. Victorian households often had frost forming on the inside of the panes, not because anyone liked it, but because insulation was essentially a rumour at the time. Curtains were heavy, walls were thick, and draught still slipped through every crack with the confidence of someone who knew you couldn't stop them. The stone floors were the real villains, beautiful, durable, elegant, and so cold that stepping onto one in the morning felt like being personally betrayed by geology. These floors held the memory of the previous night's chill so intimately that they could still be icy at noon. Wearing slippers wasn't a luxury, it was an act of survival. Victorians adapted by wearing an impressive number of indoor layers. A typical outfit inside the home included thick wool stockings, underskirts, petticoats, corsets, vests, shawls, wool jackets, and sometimes even cloak-like garments layered on top. The goal wasn't fashion, it was simply to maintain circulation. Even wealthy families were bundled up indoors like they were preparing to explore the Arctic, except the Arctic at least had the advantage of fresh air. Now let's explore the ritual of morning heating, a process that made winter mornings feel like a strategic military operation. Before the family woke, servants hurried to light fires in the main rooms. This involved carrying coal, arranging kindling, crouching over fireplaces that never seemed to cooperate, and coaxing flames to life while trying not to choke on smoke or wake anyone. If you were lucky enough to have your fire lit early, your room might warm up by, well, mid-morning, possibly. Bedrooms, however, were often left cold on purpose. Victorians believed fresh, chilly air was healthy, especially at night. Whether it felt healthy was entirely irrelevant, and so most people slept under mountains of blankets, wool, quilted, feather-filled, stacked so high you practically needed upper body strength to lift them. When you finally left your room in the morning, you stepped into corridors that felt more like underground tunnels than domestic hallways. These cold corridors acted as perfect conduits for winter air. If a guest ever visited in January, you could lead them through these icy hallways, and they'd emerge on the other side feeling like they should apologize for something. The grand staircase was especially treacherous, tall, open, elegant, and utterly impossible to heat. Warmth rose and vanished into the upper void while you trudged down the steps, bundled like a walking tapestry. And the bedrooms. Even wealthy Victorians weren't spared. Heat rarely reached the corners of their private spaces. Wealth could buy many things: servants, silk curtains, elaborate wallpaper, but it could not buy insulation. Not yet. Sleeping in a Victorian mansion in winter meant accepting that your nose, your fingertips, and occasionally your emotional fortitude would be cold until spring. But humans are adaptable creatures, and Victorians developed their own small, comforting traditions to cope with the Cold War indoors. There were hot water bottles wrapped in cloth and tucked into beds before sleep. There were warming pans, essentially metal skillets filled with coals, slid between sheets to take the edge off the icy linen. There were fire screens, decorative yet functional, placed near the hearth to block the draft while you tried to warm your knees. And above all, there was routine. Fires tended hourly, coal scuttles refilled, curtains drawn strategically to trap what little warmth existed. It was a never-ending battle between architecture and temperature usually won. Walking through the mansion on a winter morning, you would experience a patchwork of climates: a warmish drawing room, a frigid hallway, a bedroom that rivaled a walk-in freezer, and a dining room that only started to feel tolerable after breakfast. The emotional impact of this was subtle, but constant. Every room felt different. Every threshold carried a small gust of uncertainty, and the house, for all its grandeur, always felt slightly unfriendly in winter, like a cold-blooded creature that warmed only under direct firelight. The Victorians didn't mind this nearly as much as we do. This was just the way things were. Winter was cold, houses were colder, and comfort, well, comfort was something you earned by sitting close enough to the fire to risk singeing your eyebrows. To truly understand a Victorian mansion, you must slip behind the grand staircase, past the polished banisters and oil portraits, and into the hidden world that made the entire household function. Because behind every elegant dinner, warm fire, and spotless room was an army of people moving through the house like a finely tuned machine, swift, silent, and mostly invisible. Victorian society loved hierarchy the way some people love tea, repeatedly, excessively, and at every possible opportunity. And nowhere was this love more obvious than in the servant structure. It was a full ecosystem of ranks, duties, and expectations. At the top of this hierarchy stood the butler, the quiet commander of the household's operations. He was the most trusted servant, responsible for overseeing wine, silver, keys, schedules, and order. A butler had to know everything, see everything, anticipate everything, and somehow do it all with the emotional expression of a perfectly carved statue. His calm was the household's calm, his precision the household's rhythm. If anything went wrong, a late meal, a missing visitor's card, a wine bottle that dared misbehave, the butler felt it in his soul. Beside him, managing another half of the empire, was the housekeeper. She supervised the maids, linens, cleaning, bedrooms, inventories, and the 1,000 small domestic miracles that kept the mansion presentable. Housekeepers were often more powerful than the lady of the house, though no one said this out loud. They were organizational geniuses armed with keys, ledgers, and an unshakable ability to detect dust from across a room. Below them were the visible servants, or at least visible under the right lighting conditions. Footmen, dressed in uniforms polished to perfection, acted as the elegant bridge between the upstairs world and the working world behind it. They answered doors, carried dishes, polished silver, served meals, and basically existed as ornamental proof that the household was doing very well financially, thank you. Some families employed 2 or even 3 footmen purely for the aesthetic symmetry of it all. Then came the maids, the backbone of the servant machine. There were chambermaids for the bedrooms, parlour maids for the public rooms, laundry maids for the endless piles of washing, and the ever-present scullery maid, the lowest rung, the earliest riser, and the person who did every task no one else wanted. Maids woke long before dawn, scrubbed, swept, polished, hauled heated water, emptied chamber pots, aired rooms, beat carpets, and erased every trace of life before the family even opened their eyes. By the time morning tea was served upstairs, half their day's work was already complete. And finally, tucked deep within the house's warmest corner, was the cook. The cook ruled the kitchen with a ladle of iron will. She managed ingredients, menus, timings, and the delicate emotions of undercooked sauces. The kitchen was her domain, sweltering, loud, fragrant, and entirely unlike the silent formality of the rooms above. But what made this household structure truly extraordinary was not the hierarchy itself. It was the way it operated in near invisibility. The servants' day began at a time that modern humans would only willingly experience for airport emergencies. Around 5 in the morning, the house was still asleep, the corridors echoing faintly, the fireplaces cold. Servants crept through these halls like early morning ghosts, lighting fires, hauling coal, cracking open windows for a quick burst of freezing fresh air, and preparing rooms for the family to wake in a state of effortless comfort. Their footsteps were light, because silence was part of the job. A servant who made noise was a servant who risked being noticed. The Victorian household depended on this invisibility. The ideal servant did their work so efficiently, so subtly, that the family could pretend the house maintained itself through magic rather than labour. Sleep for servants was not luxurious. Many lived in attic rooms, small spaces tucked beneath the roof where the temperature swung dramatically between seasons, unbearable heat in summer, sharp cold in winter. Others slept near the kitchen or scullery, lulled to sleep by the last embers of the range. Privacy was minimal, comfort was negotiable, exhaustion was inevitable. And yet the emotional atmosphere among servants was often one of camaraderie. They shared experiences, schedules, challenges, even jokes, whispered quietly in corners where the house couldn't hear them. They knew the house better than anyone. They knew every corridor, every shortcut, every squeaky floorboard. They lived in a world the family barely glimpsed. Throughout the day, servants moved through the mansion like a carefully choreographed ballet troupe. A chambermaid sweeping through bedrooms, a footman gliding noiselessly across the dining room, a kitchen maid rushing upstairs with a tray. The butler drifting into rooms at exactly the right moment. It was a synchronized dance that kept the house breathing. And yet, despite all this movement, the family world and the servant world rarely intersected. The mansion's architecture made sure of it. Doors with hidden hinges, back staircases that twisted and turned, narrow hallways tucked behind walls. The goal was to ensure that daily work happened out of sight, visible only in its results, never in its process. Servants lived their days in shadows, brushing past warmth, luxury and comfort, without ever being invited to experience it. They lit fires they would never sit beside. They set tables for meals they would never taste. They cleaned parlours they would never relax in. The mansion depended on them, yet they belonged to spaces that the family seldom entered and visitors never imagined. And still, despite the long hours, impossible expectations and rigid rules, the servant machine kept running, smoothing the edges of Victorian life, maintaining the illusion of effortless refinement, and ensuring that the grand, cold mansion felt alive. If the upstairs world of a Victorian mansion was a museum of refinement, cool, quiet, and carefully orchestrated, then the downstairs world was its exact opposite, a roaring, sweating, clattering engine room that never once took a breath. To understand a Victorian household, you must descend into the kitchen wing, the place where elegance went to rest and reality clocked in for a double shift. The first thing you notice as you step into the kitchen is the temperature. If the rest of the mansion feels like a refrigerated chapel, the kitchen is a furnace with ambitions. The air hits you in a rush, warm, damp, and infused with the unmistakable perfume of onions, steam, and boiling stock. It's a shock to the senses, especially if you've spent the morning in icy corridors contemplating your existence. Down here, there is no contemplation. Only movement. At the heart of the chaos stands the cast iron range, a towering beast of metal and fire that dominates the room like a monarch ruling over its domain. This range is always on. Always. It crackles, hisses, roars, and breathes out waves of heat that make you instantly grateful for every cold room upstairs you once complained about. On its surface sit pots of every size, some simmering quietly, others boiling with such enthusiasm that they look ready to stage a rebellion. The lids rattle, steam rises in thick clouds, and the scent of roasting meat lingers in the air like a promise. The range's ovens glow with a heat so intense you can feel it from the doorway. The cook knows how to work every inch of it, by instinct, by experience, and by a finely tuned sense of timing that would put professional jugglers to shame. Surrounding the range is a flurry of activity. Kitchen maids chop vegetables with a speed that suggests they were born holding knives. Their boards are never empty, their hands never still. Someone is plucking a chicken. Someone else is peeling potatoes at a rhythm that could accompany a marching band. And every few minutes someone darts past carrying a pot of boiling water, as casually as if it were a bouquet of flowers. The contrast between the kitchen and the upstairs world could not be more dramatic. Upstairs you speak softly, you glide, you perform. Down here you survive. The kitchen is loud, not rudely loud, but industriously loud. Knives thudding, pots clanging, water splashing, fire popping, voices rising and falling as orders are given, clarified, repeated, and then there is the smell. Not unpleasant, just overwhelming. Roasting meat, baking bread, frying onions, boiling vegetables, stewing fruit. Aromas mix and mingle until they form a kind of edible fog that clings to your clothes and hair with affectionate determination. If upstairs smells of cold air and polished furniture, downstairs smells of life. Busy, bustling, unrelenting life. The cook presides over all of this, a commander in an apron. She's one of the most powerful figures in the household, and absolutely everyone knows it. Her word is law. Her timing is sacred. Her decisions determine whether dinner is a triumph or an embarrassment. Dishes pass through her hands with a grace that disguises the fact that she is managing a dozen things at once, and will continue doing so until the last dish goes out that night. Just beyond the main kitchen is the scullery, the wet, clattering heart of the labour system. If the kitchen is hot, the scullery is humid. If the kitchen is lively, the scullery is relentless. Here, the scullery maid stands at a deep stone sink, sleeves rolled up, washing an impossible mountain of pans and dishes. There is always more to scrub, always something crusted with something else, always a pot that needs scouring. She is the first to wake and the last to finish, moving in a cloud of steam and determination. Nearby there are prep rooms, the pantry, larder, and sometimes a pastry room. The larder stays cool thanks to stone shelves and careful window placement. Here, meats hang, cheeses rest, and ingredients wait their turn for the range. The pantry is filled with gleaming jars, tins, and dry goods. And if the household is grand enough to have a pastry room, you might find a maid delicately shaping dough in a space intentionally kept cooler, a small sanctuary of calm precision in an otherwise fiery kingdom. What's remarkable is how separate this world feels from the mansion above. You could live upstairs for weeks and never realize that just beneath your feet lies a sweating, steaming, organized inferno of activity. The kitchen is not elegant. It's not meant to be seen by guests. It's functional, efficient, and purpose-built. but it is also deeply human. Down here, servants talk more freely. They laugh. They mutter complaints under their breath. They share small moments of connection over boiling pots and flowery tables. And they work endlessly. Meals must be prepared at precise times. Food must go out warm. Dishes must be cleared, cleaned, replaced, and readied again. Breakfast blends into luncheon, into afternoon tea, into dinner, into late-night trays. The mansion above may glide through its routines with serene stillness, but below the surface the kitchen kingdom is in constant motion. Heat is the defining force here. It pours from the range, from ovens, from pots. It soaks into clothes and skin until the idea of being cold feels like a myth. The servants upstairs layer themselves like onions. The servants downstairs shed whatever they can. 2 climates in one house separated by one staircase. And yet, despite the contrast, both worlds rely completely on the other. Without the kitchen, the dining room is meaningless. Without the scullery, the drawing room loses its shine. Without the cook, the household loses its structure. When you picture a Victorian mansion, you might imagine grandeur, polished wood, glittering chandeliers, velvet drapes, elegant wallpaper. But there is one detail that rarely appears in paintings, never shows up in museum displays, and is conveniently absent from period dramas: the smell. Because if you truly want to understand Victorian domestic life, you must breathe in the atmosphere and hope you're feeling brave. Let's start with the ever-present companion of Victorian households: coal smoke. Coal powered everything: fireplaces, kitchen ranges, water heaters, and any attempt at staying alive in winter. The smell of burning coal drifted through the halls with a confidence normally reserved for aristocrats. Even when the fire was in another room, you could smell its smoky signature settling into the air like an assertive guest who decided not to leave. In colder months, the mansion often inhaled coal smoke the way a sponge absorbs water. It clung to drapes, carpets, and cushions, embedding itself in fabrics until the house developed its own personality. One that smelled faintly of ash, warmth, and inevitability. Then there were the gas lamps. Gaslight was revolutionary, brighter than candles, easier than oil lamps, but it came with an aroma that could only be described as industrial with a hint of rotten egg. Early gas systems weren't perfectly sealed, so small leaks were common. The air carried a subtle tang that made you instinctively wonder if something unsafe was happening, which, frankly, it often was. Even when the lamps behaved, they emitted heat and fumes that mixed into the household air with quiet persistence. But gas wasn't the only source of scent. The Victorians adored heavy fabrics: thick carpets, velvet curtains, upholstered furniture stuffed with horsehair or wool. These materials were perfect at trapping warmth when fireplaces worked, and perfect at trapping odours all the time. Every smell, from kitchen spices to smoke to everyday life, found a convenient home inside those fibres. Over time, the mansion developed what we can politely call a mature aroma. Not unpleasant, but certainly present. A mixture of old wood, polished furniture, dust warmed by sunlight, and upholstery that had seen things, absorbed things, and decided to remember them forever. Dust, by the way, was everywhere. The Victorians fought it heroically, but dust has no allegiance and no mercy. Every curtain fold, carved wooden surface and ceiling rose was a tiny dust collector, and dust, warmed by fireplaces and lamps, carries a subtle scent. The dry, faintly earthy smell of time settling in. Combine that with candles, which we use daily. Beeswax candles added a warm, honey-like undertone to the air. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, created a more noticeable scent, the kind that made you appreciate beeswax in a deeply emotional way. Now, move closer to the kitchen wing, and you enter a new aromatic dimension altogether. Victorian kitchens produce smells with personality. Roasting meat, boiling cabbage, baking bread, frying onions. Each aroma travelled like a determined explorer seeking new lands. And by lands, I mean new fabrics to cling to. Mansions try to contain these scents with doors and corridors, but smell is persistent. It drifted upward and outward until it became part of the home's very soul. In the summer, the situation intensified. Warm air made smells richer, thicker, slower to dissipate. A house without cross-ventilation, and many Victorian homes were not designed for meaningful airflow, became a museum of lingering scents. And then there was the mustiness. Victorian houses were often damp, not in the dramatic rain pouring through ceiling way, but in the soft, polite, constant moisture that creeps into corners and settles behind furniture. Wallpaper absorbed this dampness, especially the richly coloured, heavily patterned types Victorians adored. Over time, it created a faintly sweet, earthy smell, the scent of aged paper and moisture mingling in quiet companionship. Old books in the library contributed their own fragrance, that beautiful, dusty, slightly vanilla smell that modern people romanticize but Victorian people often associated with the faintly alarming awareness that mould existed. Even the flowers couldn't help much. Parlours and morning rooms often displayed bouquets, roses, lilies, violets, but those fresh scents were constantly battling the entrenched odours of coal, fabric and time. And while flowers wilt gracefully, they also contribute their own soft, bittersweet scent of decay. Perhaps the most surprising element of Victorian household air was its stillness. Without modern ventilation systems or open-plan layouts, rooms held onto smells. They lingered. They waited. You could walk into a drawing room hours after a fire had died, and the smell of smoke would still be curled around the curtains. Enter a dining room the morning after a dinner party, and you'd catch faint traces of last night's feast mixed with candle wax and polished silver. The house had layers, not just architectural but atmospheric. Each room carried its own blend of scents, shaped by its use, its materials and its temperature. Walking through a mansion was like moving through an invisible tapestry of aromas, each one telling a story of what happened there hours, days, or even years before. And if you were sensitive to smell, the transition between spaces could be striking. From the smoky chill of the entrance hall, to the floral disguise of the drawing room, to the rich, savoury warmth near the kitchen, to the linen-scented austerity of the bedrooms. Each room felt like stepping into a different mood. This was the invisible atmosphere of Victorian life, an ever-present mixture of heat, dust, smoke, fabric and human activity. It was not unpleasant, but it was unmistakable. And once you experienced it, stepping back outside into fresh air felt like a small, private miracle. In the modern world, we take clean, ventilated indoor air for granted. But in a Victorian mansion, the air was a living thing, layered, textured, fragrant, dusty, smoky, and saturated with the daily lives of everyone who lived and worked within those walls. If you've ever stood under a hot shower, sighed deeply and thought, yes, this is the highlight of my day, please take a moment to appreciate just how profoundly un-Victorian that experience is. In a Victorian mansion, bathing was not a daily ritual. It was not even a weekly ritual for some households. Bathing was an event, a logistical operation requiring planning, labour, cooperation, and emotional resilience. Let's start with the foundation of Victorian hygiene. Water systems that barely qualified as systems. Most mansions did not enjoy anything close to modern plumbing. Instead, water arrived through a patchwork of methods that range from mildly clever to aggressively inconvenient. Some houses used hand pumps, others upgraded to steam pumps that pushed water up to the attic, where it collected in a large tank. From there, gravity did the rest, slowly, stubbornly, and with the personality of someone who resented being asked for help. These attic tanks were the unsung heroes of Victorian water access. They sat in darkness, filled with cold water, occasionally home to a curious insect or two, and fed the household's limited taps. The water that trickled from these taps was rarely warm and never arrived quickly. If you turned a handle and something happened within a minute or two, you congratulated yourself for excellent timing. But for everyday cleanliness, Victorians didn't rely on taps. They relied on basins and pitchers, the iconic washing setup that appears so quaint in period dramas. In reality, it was a daily exercise in patience. Each morning a servant brought up a jug of water that was neither hot nor cold, but something in between. The awkward temperature that water naturally becomes when carried through a frigid hallway at dawn. You'd pour a little into the basin, dip a cloth, and begin the delicate routine of washing your face, neck, ears, hands, and, if you were feeling ambitious, perhaps your arms. This was known as a partial wash, which is Victorian for, we'll call this clean enough. The process was slow, the cloth was small, the water cooled rapidly in the chilly air. And the entire time you tried not to splash anything because cleaning up spills required even more water. Now the matter of other bodily needs was handled by the chamber pot, an object that no Victorian painting ever features prominently, but absolutely every household relied upon. Chamber pots lived under beds, behind screens, or inside discreet cabinets. In the morning a maid would collect them, which was arguably one of the least glamorous positions in history. One must applaud the scullery maids, who scrubbed them to a shine before the next day began, a task seldom mentioned in romance novels for reasons we can all understand. But what about bathing? Surely the Victorians bathed. They did, just not often and not easily. A full bath was an ordeal. First, a portable tub was brought to the bedroom or a designated washing room. It was made of metal, which meant it could be shockingly cold before water touched it, and shockingly hot once it did. Then, servants heated water in the kitchen, carried it upstairs in heavy buckets, and poured it into the tub, again and again and again. It took dozens of bucketfuls to fill the bath to a respectable level, each bucket requiring strength, balance, and the mental fortitude to avoid sloshing hot water onto priceless carpets. The bather, meanwhile, sat patiently in a room that was either freezing or suffocating, depending on how many fireplaces were lit that day. Once the bath was full, you had to decide who would use it first. Water was precious, heating was laborious, and refilling was a Herculean task. So families sometimes shared bath water, an arrangement that makes modern hygiene standards quietly faint. When you finally stepped into the tub, the experience was both glorious and treacherous. The water cooled rapidly, steam rose in billows. The metal sides felt like touching refrigerated iron. And if you soaked too long, someone would politely remind you that the water was needed elsewhere. The servants were getting tired. And your bath was becoming a luxury inconvenience. After the bath, removing the water was yet another operation. Servants scooped it out, bucket by bucket, carried it away, and tried not to curse the very concept of cleanliness. Hot water, the kind we enjoy at the twist of a tap, was a rarity. Unless the household was exceptionally modern, hot water came only from the kitchen boiler, attached to the monstrous cast-iron range. Even then, it arrived hot at the source and warm by the time it reached any room upstairs, the Victorian version of a cruel joke. It's worth noting that Victorians were not unclean people. They understood hygiene, they simply lacked the infrastructure to practice it easily. So they devised routines that made sense for their world. Frequent clothing changes, regular face and hand washing, brushing off dust, airing out rooms and embracing the surprisingly thorough ritual of the morning sponge bath. For many, cleanliness became as much about ritual as about water. You washed what you could, you stayed tidy, you perfumed what you couldn't reach, and you waited patiently for the next full bath, which might be days away, sometimes weeks for those living in harsher conditions. Walking through a Victorian mansion, you can feel how the architecture shaped the rhythm of hygiene. Narrow landings where servants carried buckets, ice-cold bedrooms where basins stood ready, attic tanks creaking faintly as they refilled, the faint scent of soap and damp cloth lingering in the air. Cleanliness was a quiet victory, won through effort, planning, and a small amount of denial. Victorian water systems built character. Or perhaps they simply built an appreciation for modern plumbing, which is almost the same thing. And yes, this is the part where you subscribe. You owe yourself that much. Victorian clothing was not clothing in the sense we know it. It was architecture. It was engineering. It was a structural commitment, one that required planning, stamina, and ideally a small support team. Before you imagine delicate gowns drifting through candlelit halls, remember this. Victorians did not simply get dressed. They assembled themselves. To begin, let's talk about layers, the foundation of the Victorian silhouette. A typical woman's morning outfit could include a chemise, drawers, stockings, petticoats, plural, because one is never enough when society demands you resemble a tasteful belle. A corset cover, a skirt, a bodice, and potentially an extra layer or two depending on the weather, her mood, or the current expectations of fashion magazines. And this was just morning wear. Nothing dramatic, nothing formal. Just the basics required to walk from the bedroom to the breakfast table without causing a scandal. Men had it easier, but only comparatively. Their wardrobe still required multiple pieces layered together. Undershirts, waistcoats, suspenders, cravats, stiff collars, tailored jackets, and trousers that were often so thick and structured they could practically stand on their own. Everything had weight. Victorian garments were heavy. They carried the kind of seriousness that made modern clothes feel like pajamas. The fabrics were thick, durable, and deeply committed to making sure you felt every inch of them. Wool, silk, taffeta, velvet. These materials weren't chosen for comfort. They were chosen because they meant something. Wealth, respectability, social standing, and occasionally spite toward the concept of breathable airflow. But it wasn't just the textiles, it was the structure. It was the fastenings, buttons, hooks, eyes, stays, laces. There were so many ways to close Victorian clothing that getting dressed without help was considered almost heroic. A corset alone required a level of arm flexibility that nature did not always supply. Many women relied on maids to tighten the laces, smooth the fabric, and ensure the silhouette was properly sculpted into the fashionable shape of the season. The corset, by the way, is one of the era's most misunderstood garments. It did not necessarily crush ribs or deny oxygen, not in the standard daily version at least, but it certainly shaped the wearer's posture. The moment it was fastened, your spine became a negotiation. You stood straighter, sat taller, breathed shallower, and shifted from person to architecture in motion. Whether you liked it or not, the garment dictated how you occupied space. Then there were the petticoats, understructures, crinolines, and bustles, each a different phase in Victorian fashion evolution. Crinolines created enormous bell shapes, wide enough that navigating a doorway became a careful geometry exercise. Bustles focused volume in the back, creating a silhouette that modern people might describe as structurally ambitious. All of this meant movement itself became a choreographed act. You didn't simply walk in Victorian clothing, you glided, you positioned your feet deliberately, you turned with intention, you sat with care, arranging your skirts like drapery being installed. Every action had a technique. Clothing taught you how to behave, one restricted breath at a time. Victorian wardrobes weren't just about shape, they were about ritual. The day was carved into wardrobe segments: morning dress, walking dress, visiting dress, afternoon dress, tea dress, dinner dress, evening dress. At any moment you might find yourself wearing something perfectly lovely and yet entirely inappropriate because the clock had advanced by 30 minutes. Men experienced this too, though with fewer layers and slightly less existential fabric drama. They shifted from morning coats to frock coats to tailcoats depending on the time of day, and the social importance of wherever they were headed. Even relaxation had dress codes. A gentleman lounging at home still wore a smoking jacket because apparently leisure must also be formally dressed. And then there were the textures. Victorian clothing had texture the way Victorian wallpaper had pattern. Abundantly, enthusiastically, and occasionally to a nearly chaotic degree. Silk rustled, taffeta crackled, lace tickled, beads clinked softly with movement. Every outfit made sound, a small but constant reminder that you were wearing something fabulous, expensive, and only mildly backbreaking. But the most important aspect of Victorian clothing was not how it looked or how it felt. It was how it defined identity. Clothing declared your status long before you opened your mouth. A well-structured outfit announced that you belonged to a household with enough wealth to afford fabric, servants, and time. The right ensemble signalled your respectability, your moral character, your place in society. Clothing told people whether you were available for conversation, whether you were visiting or being visited, and whether you understood the unspoken rules of the era. Even emotionally, clothing played a role. A morning dress felt practical. A visiting dress felt social. An evening gown felt formal, heavy, and charged with expectation. Men's attire had its own moods. The crisp confidence of a waistcoat, the sombre tone of a frock coat, the dignified stiffness of a formal collar that resisted all attempts at relaxation. A Victorian wardrobe didn't just influence behaviour, it dictated it. It shaped posture, mood, interaction, and perception. It turned the simple act of dressing into a performance that unfolded day after day, season after season. And yet beneath all the structure, weight, layers, and expectations, there was beauty. There was craftsmanship. There was elegance in how everything came together, even if it occasionally made breathing optional. Victorian clothing was a world unto itself, a world where fabric became architecture, garments became scripts, and every outfit was a quiet, intricate negotiation between body and society. If you've ever felt socially awkward, take comfort. No modern discomfort compares to living inside the Victorian etiquette system. In a Victorian mansion, etiquette wasn't just a set of rules. It was the air everyone breathed, the invisible cage that shaped every moment, gesture, and syllable. Think of it as living in a theatre where the script was centuries old. The stage directions were endlessly detailed, and improvisation was not only discouraged, it was socially fatal. Let's begin with the simple act of visiting, which was anything but simple. When you visited someone, you did not merely knock on the door and say hello. No, that would be barbaric. Instead, you presented a calling card, a small rectangle of cardstock that represented your identity, your intentions, and your commitment to the ongoing performance that was upper-class social life. The calling card ritual was so precise it bordered on choreography. You handed the card to the servant, who placed it on a silver tray, who then delivered it to the lady of the house, who interpreted it like a social oracle reading the future. Was the card bent at the top left corner? That meant you came in person. Folded at the bottom? Condolences. A little curl on the right? Congratulations. Too rigid? Too soft? Too simple? Too ornate? Every detail whispered something about your character. And if the lady of the house decided to receive you, you were admitted. Not to comfort, mind you, but to ritual conversation. Victorian conversation was a structured art form designed to reveal absolutely nothing important. You spoke of weather, health, small observations, public events, and anything that did not involve money, religion, personal feelings, or anything interesting. The goal was to create polite sound without emotional content, a talent many Victorians perfected to the point of mastery. Once admitted inside, you moved from room to room with the grace of a diplomat avoiding landmines. A slight pause could be interpreted as hesitation. A too confident stride might suggest arrogance. Sitting before being invited? Social treason. Even the act of holding your hands required strategy. Not too stiff, cold, not too limp, lazy, not too animated, chaotic. And for the love of propriety, no fidgeting. Etiquette also dictated the duration of the visit, which had a golden window, roughly 15 minutes. Too short and you seemed disinterested. Too long, and you risked becoming a burden, a Victorian nightmare. If the hostess began giving subtle cues like shifting her posture or setting down her teacup with finality, it was time to leave immediately. Lingering was not charming, it was alarming. Now let's wander into the world of dinner etiquette, a realm so detailed it could be published as its own encyclopedia. Invitations needed to be accepted promptly and graciously. Guests were seated strictly according to rank. You did not sit next to your spouse, because apparently Victorian marriage required intermittent separation for safety reasons. Once the meal began, the rules multiplied. You held your fork in the left hand, knife in the right. You did not cut all your food at once like a ravenous wolf. You did not lean. You did not slouch. You did not discuss anything that could cause emotional disturbance, intellectual stimulation, or genuine enjoyment. Politics, forbidden, money, vulgar, illness, inappropriate at the table, passionate opinions, absolutely not. Even conversation had to be divided delicately between the people on your left and right, and you were expected to switch partners halfway through the meal like some sort of polite conversational square dance. And then there was silence, which had its own rules. Pauses were not empty spaces. They were meaningful, charged moments where both parties quietly assessed each other. A pause too long could read as disapproval. Too short and you seemed overeager. Silence was a tool, a message, a social barometer. Etiquette reached beyond the dining room and into daily movement. How you walked said something about you. How you carried your gloves mattered. How loudly you laughed was a form of self-advertisement. How you entered a room communicated confidence or humility. Even where you focused your eyes during a conversation was scrutinized. Wandering eyes meant disinterest or mischief, depending on the level of eyebrow raised in response. Women, especially, lived within a web of unspoken expectations. They were expected to be graceful but not vain, sociable but not bold, intelligent but not too outspoken, modest but not dull. Even the simple act of sitting required attention. Ankles modestly together, posture straight, hands folded loosely, expression pleasant. No lounging, no sprawling, no dramatic flopping, even in private. Someone might walk in. Men were also bound by etiquette, though with slightly more breathing room. They were required to be courteous, restrained, punctual, and impeccably polite. Hats were removed at the correct moment, greetings delivered with proper firmness, and emotions expressed only in controlled doses. What made Victorian etiquette particularly exhausting was not the number of rules, though there were thousands, but the constant awareness of being observed. The mansion itself felt like a silent judge. Every polished surface, every portrait, every symmetrical arrangement seemed to silently ask, "Are you behaving correctly?" Even in private moments, etiquette lingered. You might be alone in a room, yet your posture remained proper. You might rehearse polite phrases aloud to prepare for social encounters. You might correct your own behavior preemptively, worried that somehow, somewhere, someone would know. Etiquette shaped identity. It shaped relationships. It shaped the pace and texture of daily life. It allowed people to interact without chaos, but at the cost of authenticity. Behind many polite smiles lurked stress, nerves, and the low hum of constant self-monitoring. To live in a Victorian mansion was to live on a stage, performing refinement from morning to night. Every gesture mattered. Every glance mattered. Every politely restrained comment mattered. If you want to understand the true nerve centre of a Victorian mansion, don't look to the grand staircase or the polished drawing room. Look instead to a quiet corner of the servants' quarters, usually in a hallway or narrow passage where no guest would ever wander, and you will find a device that ruled the entire household with absolute authority: the bell panel. This panel was not decorative. It was not elegant. It was purely functional and a little intimidating. A row of small brass bells, each with its own label: morning room, dining room, master's bedroom, blue bedroom, library, withdrawing room, front door, housekeeper's room, and so on, stretched across the wall like a mechanical chorus line. Each bell hung from a spring, and attached to each spring was a slender wire that snaked into the walls of the house, disappearing into floors, ceilings, and hidden cavities before reaching a specific room. A Victorian mansion was a labyrinth of secret wiring long before electricity arrived. These networks ran quietly behind the plaster, ready to bring order, or chaos, to a servant's day. When a family member wanted something, they did not shout. They did not leave their chair. They did not even raise their voice slightly. They simply reached for a cord or pressed a button, and somewhere deep within the house, a bell sprang to life. The sound of a bell ringing was unmistakable. A sharp, high note cut through the low hum of daily activity, slicing through kitchen chatter, breaking the rhythm of sweeping or scrubbing, and instantly redirecting attention. The bell didn't just ring, it vibrated, making the metal tremble like a tiny alarmed bird. The moment it sounded, every servant in earshot froze for the briefest second, identifying which bell it was. Because in a Victorian mansion, every bell mattered, and the person who heard it needed to respond immediately. Servants trained their ears to recognize each bell by tone and rhythm. Some bells rang lightly, others harshly, others with a kind of self-important shiver that suggested the master was calling. Footmen became experts at identifying bells in under a second. Maids learned to turn mid-task, instantly read the panel, and sprint silently toward the source. But before the sprint came, the tension. Waiting in the servants' hall always carried an underlying sense of anticipation. You might be polishing silver, folding linens, or taking a moment to breathe, and somewhere in the back of your mind lingered the knowledge that at any moment, a bell might snap you back into motion. Silence was not peaceful. Silence was suspense. When a bell did ring, the servant responsible for that room needed to move quickly, quietly, and with purpose. There was no strolling, no sighing dramatically, no finishing your tea first. You went instantly, because a delayed response was not considered delayed. It was considered disrespectful, and the journey to the caller was rarely straightforward. Victorian mansions were designed with efficiency for the family and inconvenience for the staff. Servant routes were a maze of back staircases, narrow corridors, steep steps, and doors that blended into wallpaper. If the family occupied the elegant front staircase, servants used the cramped spiral stairs squeezed between thick walls. These stairs seemed designed to test balance, strength, and the ability to carry trays while questioning one's life choices. Reaching the dining room, for example, might require a footman to descend one staircase, cross a service hall, climb another staircase, navigate a side passage, push through a discreet door hidden in panelling, and arrive just as the master decided his wine needed refilling. A maid might hear the bell from the blue bedroom, drop her broom, hurry down a corridor, dodge a laundry basket, duck through a low doorway, climb 3 flights of stairs, and enter the room as if she had simply been standing outside waiting patiently. The illusion of effortlessness mattered. The entire system was designed so the family never had to raise their voices, and never had to see the frantic reality happening in the walls behind them. A single pull of a cord could set an entire chain of movements into action. A tray prepared, a fire stoked, tea poured, windows opened, a dress fetched, a message delivered. The bells equalized the staff in one specific way. Everyone answered them. No matter how tired, no matter how busy, no matter what time of day, if your bell rang, the house needed you. Yet the bell system also reinforced hierarchy. The master's bell, urgent, always. The mistress's bell, equally urgent, but with a different tone of expectation. Guest room bells, high priority, guests needed to be impressed after all. The kitchen bell, constant, a background soundtrack to the cook's domain. Some bells hardly rang at all, which was a blessing for the servants assigned to those rooms, although such blessings often came with extra cleaning duties to make up for the lack of summons. The emotional impact of the bells was profound. Servants could be exhausted, aching, or halfway through a rare moment of conversation, and then ding, back to work. The sound ruled their day. It was the Victorian equivalent of a digital notification. If digital notifications required running 4 flights of stairs and carrying a tray. And yet, for all the stress the bells brought, they also represented a kind of household rhythm. A well-run house had bells ringing in a steady, predictable pattern. A chaotic day had bells overlapping, jangling and vibrating with urgent energy. Servants joked that they could tell a family's mood based on how frequently the bells went off, a kind of emotional Morse code sent through the walls. To the family, the bells were simply convenient, a way to summon comfort without disruption, a way to maintain calm and civility, a way to communicate without speaking. To the servants, the bells were the heartbeat of the house, loud, demanding, insistent, and impossible to ignore. A Victorian mansion could be silent as a cathedral, but beneath that silence was a constant hum of activity, triggered by the faint trembling of metal in the servants' quarters. The bells dictated time, they dictated movement, they dictated the pace of life itself. They were small, simple devices, and yet they controlled everyone. If you've ever hosted a dinner party and thought, "This is stressful," allow me to gently introduce you to the Victorian version, an event so elaborate, so choreographed, and so heavily staffed that modern catering companies would weep quietly in admiration. A Victorian dinner wasn't just a meal, it was an evening-long theatrical performance, and behind this graceful show lay a staggering amount of labour, timing, heat, and near-heroic endurance. Let's begin long before the first spoon touches a bowl. Hours before candles are lit upstairs, the preparation begins downstairs, where the kitchen kingdom wakes early, stretching like a dragon preparing for flight. The cook inspects ingredients with the seriousness of a jeweller examining gemstones. Meat must be fresh, vegetables crisp, spices measured precisely. Any slip, a wilted lettuce leaf, a sauce that leans slightly too salty, has the potential to ripple upward into social catastrophe. Then comes the menu, which is an architectural plan disguised as a list of dishes. A Victorian dinner might include 8, 10, or even 12 courses. Soup, fish, entrees, removes, roasts, game, pastries, desserts. Each one must arrive at the exact temperature, in the correct order, brought in with the confidence of a royal procession. To achieve this, the kitchen becomes a sort of culinary battlefield. Pans rattle, knives chop with military rhythm, pots bubble with alarming enthusiasm. The cook stands at the helm, orchestrating timing with an internal clock that borders on supernatural. "The sauce needs stirring," she announces, even though she has not looked at it. "The roast requires turning," she declares, sensing it as if through a psychic bond with the oven. Meanwhile, ingredients move through the kitchen like dancers in a feverish ballet. Fish is cleaned, scaled, seasoned, and left to rest. Pastries are rolled, shaped, filled, and sent to the cooler pantry to firm up. Stocks simmer in a quiet corner, releasing clouds of fragrant steam that fog the windows. A soup the colour of polished gold thickens in a pot the size of a child. The kitchen maids work without stopping. One chops vegetables. Another whisks a custard that must never ever curdle. Someone else skims broth. Another rolls dough. And just when the scullery maid finishes washing a towering pile of pans, Another pile arrives, steaming and unapologetic. But cooking is only the first layer of this operation. Everything must be timed perfectly. Roasts need hours, fish needs minutes, pastries need precise intervals of rest. Sauces must be finished at the last moment or risk losing their shine. Too early and dishes cool, too late and the entire sequence falters. This is where the kitchen-faced frenzy meets the calm precision of the corridors. Servants slip through narrow back passages carrying dishes that could not be spilled under any circumstances. A misstep on a hidden staircase could derail an entire course, and yet they move quickly, silently, almost invisibly, balancing trays heavy with silver dishes, gliding through service doors that open directly into the dining room like portals to another universe. Inside the dining room, everything is serene. Candles glow warmly, silver gleams, crystal glasses catch the light. Guests make elegant conversation about topics carefully chosen to avoid any hint of real emotion. They have no idea, and are never meant to know, that 20 feet away someone is sprinting with a pot of gravy that refuses to behave. Back in the kitchen, the pressure builds as the dinner progresses. Once a course leaves the room, the next one must be seconds away from perfect. The cook tastes sauces, adjusts seasonings, wipes plates meticulously. Timing becomes obsession. The fire blazes, the room grows hotter, the servants move faster, and the scullery maid, poor soul, washes dish after dish in a perpetual cloud of steam. When pastries come into play, the temperature ballet becomes even more delicate. Pastry rooms in grand houses were intentionally chilly, a small mercy amid the inferno of the main kitchen. Here, dough is shaped with cool fingertips, turned gently, coaxed into perfect folds before returning to the main kitchen's heat to be baked. It's a brief oasis of stillness before plunging back into the chaos. The final courses, delicate desserts and sweet dishes, are often the most admired by guests who comment politely on the artistry, completely unaware of the sweat and stress that went into crafting each bite. A moulded jelly shimmers like a jewel. A tart glistens with glazed fruit. These dishes look effortless, precisely because they were not. And finally, the dinner ends. The guests retire to the drawing room to talk politely about how delicious everything was. The host beams with pride. The dining room glows with the satisfaction of a performance well executed. Back in the kitchen, it looks like a battlefield after the last soldier has limped home. Pans everywhere, plates stacked to the ceiling, spatters of sauce, embers flickering low, the scullery maid beginning her 100th round of scrubbing, the cook sitting for the first time in hours, sipping a cup of tea gone cold long before she had time to drink it. And all of this, all the heat, coordination, rushing, washing, slicing, timing, has produced just one evening's meal. Tomorrow they will do it again. Victorian elegance upstairs was built on exhaustion downstairs. A dinner was never just a dinner. It was a spectacle powered by human effort, sweat, and extraordinary precision. Behind every gleaming plate in the dining room was an army of hands, and since you're still here enjoying their hard work, you really should subscribe. If you've ever cleaned your home, stepped back proudly and thought, "There, perfect," allow me to introduce you to a Victorian mansion, a house that actively rejected cleanliness as a concept, a house that fought back, a house that produced dust with the enthusiasm of a factory and collected dirt with the dedication of a lifelong hobby. No matter how hard the servants worked, and they worked with borderline mythological effort, a Victorian mansion was never truly clean. Let's start with the greatest enemy of Victorian housekeeping: dust. Dust in a mansion wasn't a mild inconvenience, it was a permanent resident. It drifted through the air from open fireplaces, coal baskets, lamp soot, kitchen smoke. The mud tracked in from boots, and even from the fibres of the heavy fabrics Victorians adored. Velvet, dust loved it. Lace, dust adored it. Intricately carved furniture with grooves deep enough to hide a family of mice? Dust practically considered it luxury real estate. A servant could sweep a parlour in the morning and return in the afternoon to find a thin new layer, shimmering mockingly across polished surfaces as if to say, "Did you miss me?" Cleaning began early, very early, long before the family woke. A maid would creep into the room like a respectful ghost and begin the daily war with broom, brush and bucket. There were no vacuums, of course. Dust had to be swept, coaxed, beaten or lifted through sheer determination. Carpets were rolled up and dragged outside, sometimes taking 2 or 3 people to manoeuvre. Then they were beaten with wooden rods until a cloud of dust rose dramatically, coating the poor maid who had been foolish enough to stand downwind. Inside, curtains were vigorously brushed, sending plumes of dust into the air, which then settled back down onto the rug that had just been swept. If the curtains were especially large, and Victorian curtains almost always were, removing them for washing was a small-scale theatrical production involving ladders, teamwork, and a deep sighing acceptance of fate. Then came the walls. Modern people rarely think about cleaning walls, but Victorians did. Soot from fireplaces drifted upward, leaving faint grey shadows on plaster. Walls were swept with long-handled brushes, carefully so as not to knock down the decorative knickknacks that Victorians loved to place on every available surface. Ceilings were another battlefield. They often grew dingy from coal smoke and oil lamp soot. To keep them respectable, ceilings had to be whitened, a process involving climbing up high ladders with pails of lime wash and painstakingly painting the ceiling again and again. This wasn't done daily, of course, but when it was done, the entire household felt the disruption. Imagine the scent of wet plaster, the powdery flakes drifting down, and the servants praying they wouldn't spill a drop on the carpet. Carved furniture, the deeply ornate pieces Victorians loved, was perhaps the most vindictive dust collector of all. Every groove, swirl, flourish, and embellishment hid dust that no amount of casual wiping could dislodge. Servants used tiny brushes, cloths wrapped around sticks, even feathers to chase particles out of crevices, and when they were done, the dust simply returned, as if insulted by their efforts. And the floors, oh, the floors! Hardwood floors were polished with beeswax and elbow grease until they gleamed. But wax collected dirt too, requiring constant buffing. Rugs were heavy and thick, woven from wool that held onto grime like a personal treasure. The hallways, with their heavy foot traffic and constant use, needed sweeping several times a day. Windows were no easier. Coal smoke from outside clung to glass, leaving streaks of soot and smudges. Cleaning a Victorian window wasn't a matter of spraying and wiping. It was an operation requiring scrubbing, rinsing, and polishing with cloths made from old linen or cotton. And of course the windows were often tall and difficult to reach. A maid dangling off a ladder with a bucket was a common and quietly terrifying sight. Now add in the fabrics, upholstery, draperies, cushions, and fabric-covered walls. Dust adored them. In wealthier homes, walls were sometimes covered in fabric instead of wallpaper. This added a luxurious texture and a luxurious ability to trap dirt, smells, soot, and the faint memory of every candle ever burned in the room. Cleaning these surfaces required patience, strength, and resignation. Then there was the matter of mats and doorways. Because Victorian streets were not exactly clean environments, mud, manure, and industrial dust being daily companions, mats had to be beaten regularly. Mud was scraped from boots on little cast-iron gratings outside doors. Servants scrubbed the entry floors daily, often more in wet weather. But perhaps the most exhausting part of Victorian cleaning wasn't the dust or the soot or the mud. It was the constancy of it all. No matter how much the servants cleaned, the mansion found ways to make more work. A fire lit in one room meant ashes in the grate. A guest sitting down meant lint on the chair. A draught under a door meant a thin trail of dust swirling across the floorboards. The house never slept, and neither, it sometimes seemed, did the cleaning routine. Servants talked about houses as if they had personalities, stubborn ones. Some rooms collected dust faster. Some fireplaces produced more soot. Some hallways simply refused to stay clean. A maid could polish a banister until it shone like glass, only for a family member to casually brush their gloved hand across it, leaving behind a whisper of residue that shouted back at her all afternoon. And yet, for all the labour, a Victorian mansion looked beautiful when freshly cleaned. Glowing under lamplight, carpets smooth, curtains neat, floors gleaming, surfaces shining, it created the illusion of ease, of wealth, of perfection. But it was only ever an illusion. Behind every polished banister, every spotless table, every dust-free cushion stood hours of labour. Dust swept away, dirt beaten out, soot scrubbed off, fabrics brushed, floors polished, walls wiped, ceilings whitened, day after day, season after season. A Victorian mansion was grand, but it was never clean. It simply looked clean for brief and glorious moments, right before the dust returned, settling softly like the house whispering, "Nice try." If you've ever walked into a room, flipped a switch, and thought, too bright, congratulations, you live in a world of unimaginable luxury. The Victorians did not flip anything. They coaxed light. They persuaded it. They negotiated with it like a moody acquaintance. And even then what they got was not illumination in the modern sense, but a soft, wavering suggestion that light might exist somewhere in the room. A Victorian mansion existed in a constant dance between gloom and glow, a half-lit world where shadows had personalities and corners seemed to harbour secrets, simply because no one could see into them properly. Let's begin with daytime, or what passed for daytime indoors. Natural light was precious but notoriously unreliable. Windows were often tall and elegant, yes, but the heavy drapes Victorians adored were excellent at blocking it. Sunlight slipped in quietly, filtered through layers of lace, fabric and dust. Even a bright morning struggled to dominate a Victorian drawing room. Instead, the room settled into a soft, muted haze, as if permanently preparing for a portrait sitting. And then, as the day moved along, the light shifted again, not gradually, but decisively. Night arrived early in a Victorian mansion. Even summer evenings grew dim long before dinner ended. Corridors turned shadowed. Staircases grew darker. Rooms took on a warm amber tint as the house prepared for its nightly transformation. This transformation began with the most ancient of companions, firelight. In Victorian rooms, firelight was not just heat. It was mood, atmosphere, and personality. Flames flickered in wide hearths, casting golden ripples across wallpaper and making every surface seem alive. Firelight moved constantly. It danced on the edges of curtains. It glowed against polished wood. It shimmered in mirrors where it multiplied into phantom flames. But it also created deep, hungry shadows. The brighter the fire glowed on the mantelpiece, the darker the corners became, creating pockets of gloom that felt like small caves. Next came candles, the humble heroes of pre-electric evening life. To light a candle was to summon a tiny sun that insisted on trembling with every breath of air. Candlelight pooled yellow and warm, but never broadly. It illuminated whatever stood closest to it and abandoned everything else to shadows. A single candle could make a face glow beautifully, while revealing none of the details of the room behind it. It was flattering, mysterious, and completely impractical for finding anything smaller than a chair. But Victorians used candles constantly, on mantels, side tables, writing desks, and dinner tables. At night, homes became constellations of tiny flames, each one carrying the faint scent of wax and warmth. Then there were the gas lamps, the technological pride of the era, even if they were, by modern standards, mildly hazardous and occasionally alarming. Gas lamps hissed softly, emitting a steady, firm glow that was far brighter than candles, but also far moodier than electric bulbs. The hissing flame vibrated behind glass globes or metal shades, creating a steadier light than fire, but still flickering enough to remind you that it was alive. Gaslight had a distinctive quality. It created shadows that appeared sharper and more dramatic. A bus cast a long cinematic silhouette. A chair became a looming figure on the wall. Faces glowed warmly, but eyes sparkled strangely, giving people a slightly haunted look. The unintentional Victorian aesthetic, and the lamps heated the room. Not enough to make you comfortable, let's not get carried away, but enough to alter the air. A gaslit room felt warm, dense, and a little bit sleepy, as if the light itself weighed something. Victorians learned to navigate these strange lighting conditions. They read near windows during the day. They positioned chairs near lamps at night. They used mirrors strategically to bounce firelight into darker corners. Entire rooms were arranged around light sources, not aesthetics. Want to host lively conversation? Sit near the lamp. Want to look mysterious? Choose candlelight. Want to hide the fact that you haven't dusted properly? Rely on shadow. Even the colours of Victorian decor were chosen with low light in mind. Deep reds, greens, blues and golds drank in the flickering warmth of fire and gas, giving rooms an almost theatrical richness. Powdery pastels or bright whites would have looked ghostly. But jewel tones came alive at night, the constant interplay of light and shadow-shaped mood. Evening routines felt intimate, almost secretive. A letter written by candlelight felt more personal. A conversation whispered near a fire seemed deeper. Even a silent moment, the kind where you stare into the flame and forget what you intended to do, carried weight. Light shaped behaviour too. You moved more slowly in dim corridors. You stepped carefully down staircases. You leaned closer to people when speaking softly. You noticed details differently, the glint of polished metal, the warm glow of skin, the sharp line of shadow beneath a chair. Victorian nights also came with limitations. You couldn't simply brighten a corner with a switch. Want more light? Light another candle? Want even more? Call a servant and ask them to bring several. Hosting a party could involve lighting dozens of flames, each of which had to be monitored, adjusted and snuffed at the end of the evening. And yet, despite all the inconvenience, Victorian light had a beauty we've largely forgotten. A room lit by candles and gas had depth, mystery, mood. Every flicker changed the scene. Every shadow felt alive. Night didn't just fall, it flowed softly into the house, settling into corners, waiting patiently. Living in Victorian light was like living inside a painting, warm in parts, dark in others, always dynamic. It made the world feel smaller, quieter, more intimate. It demanded attention, patience, and acceptance. The Victorians lived life half in darkness, not because they enjoyed gloom, but because their world was built on flickering flames and hissing lamps. And in that shadowed world, night arrived early, but never without charm. For all the grandeur, ritual, hierarchy and polished elegance of Victorian mansions, the lifestyle built inside them was never built to last. It looked timeless, but it was fragile. Beautiful, yes, but propped up by an economic and social system so complicated and so labour-hungry that the slightest shift made the whole thing wobble. And over time, those shifts arrived one after another, like polite knocks on the door that slowly became impossible to ignore. The beginning of the end arrived quietly, rising taxes. For centuries, landowners enjoyed low taxation while renting out farmland to tenants. But as Britain modernised, the government needed revenue. New taxes on property, income and land landed with the grace of a falling piano. Suddenly owning a giant house with 20 bedrooms, 3 staircases, and a kitchen large enough to host a sports tournament was less luxurious and more financially ruinous. Heating it, maintaining it, staffing it. Every one of those things became dramatically more expensive. Then came the changing labour market, which may sound boring, but was essentially the dagger to the heart of the Victorian household. For generations, service work was one of the few stable occupations available to the working class. You might not earn much, but you had a roof, meals, and a clear role. But as factories, shops, offices, and urban jobs expanded, something revolutionary happened. People had options. Why scrub coal dust from a staircase at dawn when you could work in a shop with regular hours, your own evenings, and maybe even a sense of independence? Servants began leaving, slowly at first, then steadily. Entire households felt it. The workload went up, the staff numbers went down. A mansion designed for 20 servants could not function with 7. Something had to give. And then came World War I, which didn't just shake society, it rearranged it. Many young men who had worked as footmen, gardeners, coachmen, and butlers enlisted and never returned. Women who had filled domestic roles temporarily stepped into factory work, transport, nursing, and clerical positions, and discovered they preferred it. It turns out that earning your own money in a job with set hours was far more appealing than spending your life polishing someone else's silver. After the war, women did not rush back into service. They didn't want to. They didn't need to. Suddenly, households that once had 15 or 20 servants now struggled to hire even 2. And without that workforce, the mansion lifestyle became impossible. It wasn't that the wealthy didn't want servants, it was that the servants didn't want them. Meanwhile, coal costs were rising sharply. Coal, once the faithful companion of Victorian warmth, became a financial burden. Heating a mansion had always been expensive, but now it was outrageously so. Lighting dozens of fireplaces felt like lighting cash on fire. Rooms grew colder. Families stopped using whole wings simply because they couldn't afford to heat them. Large rooms were shut, sheeted, and left to gather dust in dignified silence. On top of that, new technologies emerged, and they were shockingly egalitarian. Electricity, gas boilers, central heating, indoor plumbing, vacuum cleaners, all these inventions had an unexpected consequence. They made life easier for everyone, not just the wealthy. A smaller modern house could now provide comfort that rivaled, and often surpassed, the cold grandeur of a mansion. Why live in an enormous home requiring an army of workers, when a smaller house could be warm, efficient, and manageable? Why keep the dining room, the music room, the withdrawing room, the morning room, and the library heated when only 1 or 2 rooms were actually used? The math no longer made sense, and so the Grand Victorian mansion began its slow retreat. Families that once hosted lavish dinners now gathered in a single heated sitting room. Staircases went unused. Hallways grew silent. Bedrooms remained closed for months. Servants' quarters emptied. Kitchens shrank. Bells fell quiet on the walls, their wires leading to rooms no one walked into anymore. Some estates tried to keep up appearances, clinging desperately to the rituals that had once defined them. But the world was changing. The pace was faster. The social structure was shifting. The idea of maintaining a large staff and a sprawling home seemed outdated, almost absurd. Meanwhile, death duties, taxes placed on inherited estates, delivered another devastating blow. Families inheriting mansions were often forced to sell land, furnishings, or entire properties simply to pay the tax. Generations of accumulated wealth evaporated within a decade. And then came the emotional collapse, the realization that the lifestyle itself no longer fit the modern world. Women working outside the home, men pursuing urban careers. Children educated in cities. The country house became less a home and more a relic. Beautiful, yes, but impractical. By the mid-20th century, many Victorian mansions were in decline. Roofs leaked. Gardens grew wild. Furniture was sold. Some houses were converted into schools, hotels, or museums. Others decayed slowly, windows breaking, staircases sagging, dust settling like a final shroud. A few found new life through restoration, but many simply faded, not because they weren't magnificent, but because the society that built them no longer existed. A Victorian mansion depended on human labour, strict hierarchy, rigid etiquette, inexpensive fuel, inherited wealth, and a large pool of workers willing to devote their lives to domestic service. When those pillars crumbled, the mansions followed. What remains today are echoes, grand rooms filled with stillness, corridors with memory instead of footsteps, and a lingering sense of how vast, complicated, and impossibly delicate the old system truly was. The Victorian mansion lifestyle didn't collapse suddenly. It unravelled quietly piece by piece until its foundations were gone. The world changed, and the mansions, unable to change with it, slowly fell silent. And now, you've reached the end of the house. You've walked the cold corridors, stepped through shadowed rooms, followed servants through narrow staircases, and listened to the quiet hum of a world built on routines that no longer exist. Victorian mansions were beautiful, breathtaking even, from the outside. Towers, chimneys, elegant stonework, dramatic windows, a silhouette designed to impress anyone passing by. But inside, life was complicated. Inside, luxury came with drafts demands and a daily schedule powered by invisible labour. Inside, everything elegant had someone sweating behind it. You've seen both worlds now, the polished surface and the machinery beneath. You've stood in the chill of the entrance hall, tasted kitchen steam, heard the bells tremble, watched shadows stretch long across velvet carpets, and now, slowly, gently, it's time to step back out. So imagine the front door opening for you. Just a little. Enough to let in a soft breath of air from today, not 1880. Step through it. There's the warmth of your own home waiting, the heat that arrives without coal, the light that stays steady without a hiss, the silence that isn't filled with the sense that someone is judging your posture from a portrait frame. You don't need layers of wool. You don't need a servant waiting behind a door. You don't need to announce a visit with a calling card. You're back in the world of modern comforts, central heating, endless hot water, clothes that let you breathe, rooms that don't demand perfect etiquette, and air that doesn't taste faintly of soot. Let the mansion fade behind you now. Its echoes, its rituals, its shadows, all softening, all growing distant. You've wandered through its secrets, learned its rhythms, felt its weight, and you've made it all the way to the last step of the tour. If you enjoyed this long walk through history, if you found yourself settling deeper into the story, drifting through the halls with me, then know that supporting this channel genuinely helps me make more of these journeys for you. And honestly, after everything you've just listened to, you've definitely earned the right to subscribe. It's free, it takes a second, and it quietly tells the algorithm that you care about this work more than Victorians cared about heating their homes. Thank you for being here. You make this possible. More than you know.